Do you believe that we only live once? What if we told you that there are children all around the world who remember living completely different lives before they were ever born? And these aren't just vague feelings or dreams. These are specific memories with names, addresses, and details that have been verified and confirmed by researchers. If you think there has to be a logical explanation for everything, then we're genuinely curious how you're going to explain these cases. Because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about life, death, and what happens in between. So let's start with the case that inspired this entire video. And trust us, this one is absolutely extraordinary. Number 10. The boy who remembered his home on a faraway island. Cameron Macaulay was just 2 years old when he first started talking about his other family. At first, his mother Norma thought it was just childhood imagination. Kids make up stories all the time. But Cameron wasn't making up stories. He was remembering. He spoke constantly about a white house that overlooked the beach. He described watching planes land on the water from his bedroom window. He talked about a black and white dog that he used to play with. And he mentioned his other mother, a woman he clearly missed with all his heart. The details were incredibly specific. Cameron said his father's name was Shane Robertson. He described the house having 3 toilets, which he found particularly impressive. He talked about his brothers and sisters, and most importantly, he kept mentioning a place called Barra, a remote island in the Outer Hebrides of Scotland, more than 200 miles from where Cameron actually lived in Glasgow. Norma had never been to Barra. She had never even heard of it until Cameron started talking about it. At first, she tried to dismiss his stories, but Cameron wouldn't let go. He became increasingly distressed about being separated from his Barra family. He cried because he missed them. He drew pictures of the White House on the beach, and he begged his mother to take him back home. When Cameron was about 5 years old, a documentary filmmaker named Jim Bruce heard about the case and offered to take the family to Barra to see if anything Cameron remembered was actually real. Norma agreed, partly because she wanted answers, and partly because she hoped the trip would finally give Cameron some peace. The journey to Barra requires a flight from Glasgow to a tiny airstrip on the island, one of the few places in the world where planes land directly on a beach. And this is where things start getting truly strange. Because as the plane descended toward the beach, Cameron pressed his face against the window and said with complete certainty that he used to watch the planes landing just like this from his bedroom window. When they arrived on the island, Cameron immediately seemed to know his way around. He pointed out locations and buildings as if he had lived there his entire life. The documentary crew decided to show him photographs of different houses to see if he could identify the one from his memories. Cameron looked through several photos without reacting, but then they showed him one particular image, a white house overlooking the beach. Cameron's face changed completely. "That's my house," he said, without any hesitation. "That's where I lived with my other family." The house was real. It was exactly where Cameron said it would be, overlooking the bay where planes landed on the beach. And here's where it gets even more fascinating. Researchers discovered that a family named Robertson had indeed lived in that house decades earlier. They found evidence of a man who matched Cameron's description of his previous father, and locals confirmed that the family had owned a black and white dog. Cameron walked around the property as if he had done it 1,000 times before. He pointed to where his old bedroom used to be, the exact room that would have had a view of the planes landing on the beach. Inside the house, there were indeed 3 toilets, just as Cameron had described, an unusual feature for a home of that era. But perhaps the most emotional moment came when Cameron sat by the window, looking out at the bay, and quietly said that this was where he used to sit and watch the world go by. His mother Norma watched her son and realized that something extraordinary was happening. This wasn't imagination. Cameron knew things about this house, this island, and this family that he simply couldn't have known. After the trip, Cameron's obsession with Bara began to fade. It was as if returning to the island and seeing the house had given him some kind of closure. He stopped crying about his other family. He stopped begging to go back. Whatever he needed to find, he had found it. Dr. Jim Tucker, a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia who has spent decades studying children's past life memories, reviewed Cameron's case. He noted that the specificity of Cameron's memories, the emotional connection to people he had never met, and the verification of details made this one of the most compelling cases he had ever encountered. So how do you explain a toddler in Glasgow knowing the exact layout of a house on a remote Scottish island? How do you explain him recognizing a photograph of that house before ever setting foot on the island? And how do you explain the verified existence of a family named Robertson who lived exactly where Cameron said they did? Some researchers believe Cameron accessed what they call cellular memory, information somehow encoded at a level beyond ordinary consciousness. Others believe he is living proof of reincarnation, and others still have no explanation at all, but acknowledge that something extraordinary happened. That was just the beginning. The cases you're about to hear are even more extraordinary. Subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It's completely free and helps us continue making these fascinating videos. Thank you so much. Number 9. The boy who was shot down over the Pacific. This case is considered by many researchers to be the most thoroughly documented example of past life memory in modern history. And once you hear the details, you'll understand why. James Leninger was barely 2 years old when the nightmares began. He would wake up screaming in the middle of the night, thrashing in his bed, yelling about fire and explosions. His parents, Andrea and Bruce, would rush into his room to find their toddler soaked in sweat, terrified, crying out the same words over and over. Airplane crash. Little man can't get out. At first, they thought it was just bad dreams, but the nightmares kept happening, sometimes multiple times a week. And then James started talking about the dreams during the day. He described being a pilot. He described flying a plane that got shot. He described the plane catching fire and crashing into the water. And he described not being able to escape. Keep in mind, James was 2 years old. He had never seen a war movie. He had never been exposed to content about fighter planes or combat. His parents were baffled about where these detailed images could possibly be coming from. Then James started providing specific information that changed everything. He said the name of the pilot he used to be was James. He said he flew a Corsair. He said he took off from a ship called the Natoma. And he said he was shot down by the Japanese at Iwo Jima. Bruce Leininger was skeptical. He didn't believe in reincarnation or past lives, but as a logical man, he decided to investigate his son's claims just to prove there was a rational explanation. What he discovered shattered every assumption he had ever made. There really was an escort carrier called the USS Natoma Bay that served in the Pacific during World War II. And there really was a pilot named James Houston Jr. who flew Corsairs from that exact ship. And on March 3, 1945, James Houston Jr. was killed in action during the Battle of Iwo Jima when his plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire and crashed into the ocean. Bruce couldn't believe what he was finding. The details matched perfectly. But surely there had to be another explanation. Maybe James had somehow been exposed to this information. Maybe he had overheard something on television. So Bruce dug deeper. He tracked down the surviving pilots who had served with James Houston Jr. on the Natoma Bay. He contacted them and asked about the mission on March 3, 1945. One of the veterans, a man named Jack Larson, confirmed that he was flying directly alongside James Houston that day. He watched Houston's plane get hit. He watched it catch fire. He watched it plunge into the ocean. When Bruce told Jack Larson that his 2-year-old son seemed to have memories of being James Houston, the old pilot was stunned. How could a child in Louisiana know the exact details of a mission that happened before his parents were even born? But it didn't stop there. James started providing even more specific details. He named the other pilots who flew with him. He described the ship's layout. He talked about an incident where a tire blew out during a practice landing, something that actually happened and was documented in the ship's records. And then came the most emotional moment of all. When James was about 4 years old, his parents showed him a photograph of Natoma Bay veterans at a reunion. James pointed to one of the men in the photograph and said, "That's him. That's James." He was identifying himself from a past life. James Houston Jr.'s sister, Ann Barron, was still alive when the Leiningers reached out to her. She was 84 years old and had spent decades mourning the brother who died at 21. When she met little James Leininger, she was overwhelmed. The boy knew things about her brother's life that only family members would know. He knew the nickname she used for him. He knew details about their childhood home. He knew personal stories that had never been published anywhere. Ann Barron said that after meeting James Leininger, she believed without any doubt that he carried the soul of her brother. It gave her peace after 60 years of grief. Dr. Jim Tucker documented this case extensively and considers it one of the strongest on record. The sheer number of verified details, the emotional connections to living witnesses, and the complete absence of any normal explanation make the James Leininger case genuinely remarkable. And if you think that's incredible, wait until you hear what happened next. Number 8. The Hollywood child who remembered his past as a movie extra. Ryan Hammonds was 4 years old when he started having vivid dreams about a different life. He described bright lights and cameras. He talked about dancing on stages. He mentioned big buildings and fancy cars. And he kept saying he wanted to go back to Hollywood. His mother, Cindy, was confused. They lived in a small town in Oklahoma. Ryan had never been to California. He had never seen old Hollywood movies. Where was this coming from? Then Ryan started getting more specific. He described living in a house with a swimming pool. He talked about traveling on big boats across the ocean. He mentioned knowing people who were in the movies, and he expressed frustration that he couldn't remember his name from before, the name he used to have when he was somebody else. Cindy began researching reincarnation and past life memories. She came across the work of Dr. Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia and decided to reach out. What happened next would become one of the most carefully documented cases in the field. To help Ryan access more memories, Cindy started showing him books about old Hollywood. One day, she was flipping through a book about 1930s movies when Ryan suddenly grabbed the page and pointed to a man in a crowd scene. He said, "That's me. That's who I used to be." The man in the photograph was not a famous actor. He was an extra, a face in the crowd that most people wouldn't even notice. There was no name listed, no identification, just an anonymous figure from a forgotten scene in an old film. Dr. Tucker took on the case. He obtained the original photograph and began trying to identify the unknown man. After extensive research, they discovered that the man Ryan had pointed to was named Marty Martin, a movie extra and talent agent who worked in Hollywood during the Golden Age. What Ryan revealed about Marty Martin's life was astonishing. He said Marty had been married multiple times. Records showed this was true. He said Marty had traveled to Paris on a boat. Records confirmed Marty had taken transatlantic voyages. He said Marty's house had a swimming pool. Photographs proved this was accurate. Ryan mentioned that Marty knew someone famous who was in movies and had changed her name. Research showed that Marty Martin was a talent agent who represented several actresses, including one who had indeed changed her stage name. But then Ryan said something that researchers couldn't verify at first. He said Marty had two sisters. All available records showed that Marty Martin was an only child. Dr. Tucker tracked down Marty Martin's daughter, a woman who was still alive and had never spoken publicly about her father. When researchers asked her about siblings, she confirmed something that no records had ever shown. Marty Martin did have two sisters. He just never talked about them publicly. Ryan knew things about a stranger from the 1930s that even official records didn't contain. He knew personal family details that only the man's own daughter could verify. He had recognized himself in a photograph among dozens of anonymous faces. Over time, Ryan's memories of being Marty Martin faded, as they usually do with children who report past lives. But the evidence he provided, while those memories were fresh, remains one of the most meticulously documented cases ever recorded. Absolutely incredible. But the next case will challenge your understanding even more. Before we continue, here's a quick question for you. If you could remember a past life, would you want to know the details? Would you want to meet the family you left behind? Or would you prefer to focus only on this life? Write your answer in the comments below. We're genuinely curious to hear what everyone thinks. Number 7. The Indian girl who returned to her previous family. This case is one of the oldest and most famous past life memory cases in history. It was investigated while the subject was still a child, and the verification of details happened in real time, with witnesses documenting everything. Shanti Devi was born in Delhi, India in 1926. By the time she was 4 years old, she started telling her parents that she didn't belong with them. She said her real name was Lugdi, and she had a husband named Kedar Nath who lived in a city called Mathura. She said she had died giving birth to a child and desperately needed to return to her real family. Her parents were disturbed by these claims. They tried to discourage Shanti from talking about her other life, but she wouldn't stop. She provided increasingly specific details. She described her house in Mathura. She described her husband's physical appearance. She described the details of her death during childbirth. When Shanti was about 9 years old, one of her teachers became intrigued by her claims. He wrote a letter to the address Shanti provided in Mathura, addressed to Kedarnath, the man she claimed was her husband in her previous life. To everyone's astonishment, a response came back. There was indeed a man named Kedarnath living at that exact address, and his wife Lugdi had died during childbirth about a decade earlier, around the time Shanti claimed to have died. Kedarnath travelled to Delhi to meet the girl who claimed to be his reborn wife. When he arrived, Shanti immediately recognized him. She called him by pet names that only Lugdi would have known. She asked about specific relatives by name. She inquired about items in their home in Mathura. Kedarnath was shaken to his core. This child knew intimate details about his marriage that he had never shared with anyone. She knew secrets that only his wife could have known. The case became a national sensation in India. A committee was formed to officially investigate Shanti Devi's claims. The committee travelled with Shanti to Mathura, a city she had never visited in her current life. What happened next was documented by multiple witnesses. Shanti led the committee through the streets of Mathura as if she had lived there her entire life. She pointed out landmarks. She identified changes that had been made since Lugdi's death. When they approached the house where Lugdi had lived, Shanti became visibly emotional. Inside the house, Shanti identified objects that had belonged to Lugdi. She recognized family members she had never met in this life. And in one of the most powerful moments, she correctly identified the location where Lugdi had hidden money, a secret that not even Kedarnath had known about. The committee's investigation concluded that Shanti Devi had indeed demonstrated knowledge that could not be explained by any normal means. They published their findings, and the case became internationally famous. Mahatma Gandhi himself took an interest in Shanti Devi's story and met with her to discuss her memories. The case remains one of the most thoroughly documented and witnessed examples of past life memory ever recorded. Shanti Devi lived her entire life dealing with the weight of two identities. She never married, saying that she still considered Kedarnath to be her husband. She wrote about her experiences and spoke about them publicly until her death in 1987. What makes this case so compelling is not just the verified details, but the emotional reality of Shanti's experience. She genuinely felt that she had left a family behind, a husband and a child she had died giving birth to. And when she returned to Mathura, she wasn't visiting a strange place. She was coming home. That was deeply moving. But the cases ahead are about to get even more intense. Number 6. The twins who remembered being their own sisters. This case is different from the others because it doesn't involve memories of strangers. It involves something far more personal and far more disturbing. In 1957, the Pollock family of Hexham, England, experienced an unimaginable tragedy. Their two daughters, Joanna, age 11, and Jacqueline, age 6, were walking to church when they were struck and killed by a car. The driver had deliberately driven onto the sidewalk. Both girls died instantly. John and Florence Pollock were devastated. Their two daughters, their only children, were gone. Florence didn't think she could survive the grief. But then, about a year after the accident, Florence discovered she was pregnant. Despite doctors telling them to expect a single baby, John Pollock insisted that Florence was carrying twins. He told people that God was going to give them their daughters back. Most people thought he was dealing with his grief in an unhealthy way. But when Florence gave birth in October 1958, she delivered twin girls. They named them Gillian and Jennifer. From the moment the twins were born, their parents noticed something strange. Jennifer, the younger twin by minutes, had 2 birthmarks that exactly matched marks that Jacqueline had on her body. One was a birthmark on her hip in the same location as Jacqueline's birthmark. The other was a thin white line on her forehead, identical to a scar Jacqueline had received from a fall. The family moved away from Hexham when the twins were 3 months old, partly to escape the painful memories. The twins had no exposure to their older sisters' lives. No photographs were displayed. No stories were told. Their parents deliberately kept them from any information about Joanna and Jacqueline. But when the twins were about 4 years old, they started saying things that made their parents' blood run cold. Without any prompting, the twins began asking for toys that had belonged to Joanna and Jacqueline. Toys they had never seen, toys that had been put away in storage. They asked for them by the correct names, names their parents had never mentioned. Jennifer pointed to Gillian's birthmark one day and said, "That's the mark you got when you fell down." Joanna had said almost the exact same words to Jacqueline about that scar years before the twins were born. The most disturbing moment came when the family returned to Hexham for a visit when the twins were 4. The twins had no conscious memory of ever being there. But as they drove through the town, the girls started pointing out landmarks and buildings, correctly identifying places before their parents had said anything. They knew which direction the school was before they could see it. They recognized the playground where Joanna and Jacqueline used to play. And when they approached the spot where their sisters had been killed, both girls became extremely agitated, clutching each other and crying out about a car coming to get them. Dr. Ian Stevenson, the pioneering researcher in past life memories, investigated the Pollock case extensively. He documented the birthmarks, the recognition of toys, the fear response near the accident site, and the dozens of small details the twins seemed to know about the lives of their deceased sisters. Perhaps most significantly, the twins had distinct personality traits that matched their older sisters. Gillian was the leader, more mature and protective, exactly like Joanna. Jennifer was more dependent and playful, exactly like Jacqueline. The birth order had reversed. Joanna was older and Jacqueline younger, while Gillian was the firstborn, but the personality dynamics remained identical. By the age of 5, the twins' memories began to fade. They stopped asking for the old toys. They stopped recognizing places in Hexham. The window had closed. But the Pollock twins case remains one of the most compelling examples of what some researchers call same-family reincarnation, the idea that souls can return to the same family, sometimes to heal trauma, sometimes to complete unfinished business. John Pollock believed, until the day he died, that God had returned his daughters to him. Whether you interpret this case spiritually or look for other explanations, the documented details are genuinely remarkable. The next case adds yet another layer to this mystery. Get ready. Number 5. The boy who was his own grandfather. Gus Taylor was 18 months old when he started saying something that terrified his father. Gus would look at his father, Ron, and say things like, "I used to be your daddy. I used to change your diaper." Ron Taylor's father had died a year before Gus was born. The old man had never met his grandson, and yet here was a toddler claiming to be his own grandfather, providing details he couldn't possibly know. At first, Ron tried to dismiss it as strange baby talk. Kids say weird things. but Gus kept adding details. He talked about his sister, Ruth, who had been murdered. Ron's father did indeed have a sister named Ruth, who was killed in the 1960s, a family tragedy that was never discussed. When Gus was about 4 years old, the family was looking through old photographs. Without any prompting, Gus pointed to a photo of his grandfather as a young man and said, "That's me. That's who I was." What made this identification remarkable was the context. The photograph showed Gus's grandfather at a young age, looking nothing like the elderly man Ron would have described if he ever talked about his father. Gus identified a young man from decades before Ron was even born. The details kept accumulating. Gus described his grandfather's car, a detail his father had never mentioned. He talked about working at a specific job, information that matched his grandfather's employment history. And he consistently referred to Ron's childhood home as "my house," showing a possessive familiarity that went beyond what any toddler should have. Dr. Jim Tucker documented this case and noted several features that made it particularly interesting. The past life personality was a direct family member, making verification straightforward. The child had no normal access to the information he was providing, and the specific details about the murdered sister Ruth were especially compelling because the family never discussed that tragedy. For Ron Taylor, the experience was deeply emotional. On one hand, he struggled with the idea that his toddler son might carry the consciousness of his deceased father. On the other hand, there was something comforting about the possibility that his father's essence had returned to the family in the form of this new child. As with most cases, Gus's memories faded as he grew older. By age 5 or 6, he stopped talking about being his grandfather. The window of access to those past life memories had closed. But for those years when the memories were fresh, Gus Taylor provided evidence that something extraordinary had happened. He described events from before his birth, identified people from photographs he had never seen, and demonstrated an emotional connection to family tragedies that were deliberately kept secret. Whether you believe this is reincarnation or some other phenomenon, the fact remains that a toddler in the 2000s knew accurate details about a man who died in the 1990s, including information that even his own parents didn't know he knew. Absolutely fascinating. And the next case introduces something even more puzzling. Number 4. The boy who spoke a language he never learned. This case adds a completely different dimension to the reincarnation question. Because it's one thing for a child to remember facts about a past life. It's another thing entirely for a child to speak a language they have never been exposed to. The phenomenon is called xenoglossy, the ability to speak or understand a foreign language without ever having learned it. And one of the most famous cases involved an American child who began speaking what appeared to be an ancient Tibetan dialect. The boy, whose identity was kept confidential to protect his privacy, was about 4 years old when he started having episodes where he would speak in a language his parents couldn't identify. It wasn't gibberish. It had structure, rhythm, and what sounded like actual vocabulary. But nobody in his family, his school, or his community could understand what he was saying. His parents recorded these episodes and consulted with linguists. What they discovered was astonishing. The sounds the boy was making bore strong resemblance to words from an ancient Tibetan dialect, a form of speech that wasn't even commonly used in modern Tibet. During these episodes, the boy would also make specific hand gestures associated with Buddhist practices, gestures he had never seen demonstrated. He would sometimes appear to be chanting or reciting something, maintaining rhythms and patterns that matched traditional Tibetan religious recitations. When questioned about these episodes, the boy said he was remembering being a monk who lived in the mountains. He described a monastery with high walls and cold air. He described robes and rituals and a life dedicated to spiritual practice. And he expressed sadness that he had left that life behind. Researchers who studied this case acknowledged that proving xenoglossy is extremely difficult. Could the boy have been exposed to these sounds somewhere? Could he have heard recordings or seen videos? The parents insisted they had no materials related to Tibet or Buddhism in their home, but critics argued that ambient exposure couldn't be entirely ruled out. What made the case compelling was not just the language, but the entire package of memories and behaviors. The boy demonstrated knowledge of specific religious practices, described accurate details about monastic life, and exhibited emotional responses consistent with someone remembering a lost identity. Dr. Ian Stevenson documented several xenoglossy cases during his career, though he acknowledged they were rare and difficult to verify. He noted that if genuine, xenoglossy would represent some of the strongest possible evidence for reincarnation, because language is not something that can be absorbed passively. It requires active learning, unless, of course, it was learned in a previous life. The debate about this case continues. Skeptics argue for hidden exposure or false memories. Believers argue that the complexity and accuracy of the language performance couldn't be faked by a 4-year-old. What everyone agrees on is that the case raises profound questions about the nature of memory, consciousness, and identity. Speaking of profound, the next case might be the most emotional one yet. Number 3. The child who found his own killer. This case from the Middle East has been reported multiple times and represents one of the most dramatic and disturbing past life memory stories ever documented. And unlike other cases where past lives ended naturally, this child claimed to remember being murdered. A 3-year-old boy from the Golan Heights region began telling his parents that he had been killed with an axe. He said he remembered exactly where it happened. He said he knew who did it. And he said he could show them where his body was buried. In this community, past life memories in children were taken seriously. Rather than dismissing the boy's claims, village elders decided to investigate. They asked the boy to lead them to the location of his previous life. The boy guided them to a nearby village. He walked directly to a specific house and confronted a man who lived there. The boy looked at the man and said, "You killed me." According to witnesses, the man's face turned white. The boy then led the group to a location in a field and said his body was buried there. When they dug at that exact spot, they discovered human remains. The skeleton showed evidence of a head wound consistent with being struck by an axe. Confronted with this evidence, the man confessed. He admitted that he had killed a man years earlier in a dispute and buried the body exactly where the child had indicated. He had never told anyone. The crime had gone completely undiscovered until this 3-year-old boy, claiming to be the reincarnated victim, led authorities directly to the grave. The case was documented by Dr. Eli Lash, a physician who had worked in the region and witnessed the investigation personally. He described it as the most remarkable case he had ever encountered, not because of vague memories, but because the child's testimony led directly to the discovery of a hidden crime and the confession of a murderer. What makes this case so powerful? is the practical consequence. This wasn't just a child sharing interesting memories about a past life. This was a child identifying his own murderer and revealing the location of his own remains. The information was specific enough to solve a cold case that no one even knew existed. Critics have raised questions about the cultural context. In communities where reincarnation is expected, could children be inadvertently coached, or could they pick up information from community gossip? The investigators in this case insisted that the burial location was completely unknown, making community knowledge impossible. But the core fact remains. A 3-year-old child led adults to human remains that no one knew were there, and he correctly identified the man who killed him. Whatever explanation you choose to believe, that is genuinely extraordinary. Trust me, the remaining cases are just as remarkable. Number 2. The scientist who spent 50 years studying these children. Before we get to our final case, we need to talk about the man who transformed past life memory research from fringe speculation into legitimate scientific inquiry. Dr. Ian Stevenson was a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia who began investigating children's past life memories in the 1960s. Over the course of nearly 50 years, he documented more than 3,000 cases from cultures around the world. His methodology was rigorous, his documentation was meticulous, and his findings challenged everything mainstream science believed about consciousness and memory. Stevenson didn't just collect stories. He traveled to remote villages, conducted extensive interviews, cross-checked details with official records, and looked for every possible normal explanation before considering reincarnation. He was a skeptic by training, a scientist by profession, and he approached each case determined to disprove it if possible. What he found instead was a consistent pattern that appeared across cultures, religions, and continents. Children between the ages of 2 and 5 would spontaneously begin reporting memories of previous lives. They would provide specific names, locations, and details, and in hundreds of cases, these details could be verified. Stevenson documented several features that appeared repeatedly in these cases. Children often had birthmarks or birth defects that corresponded to wounds the previous personality had suffered, especially fatal wounds. Children frequently had phobias that matched how their previous personality had died, such as fear of water in children who remembered drowning. And children showed emotional connections to the previous family that went beyond what acquaintance could explain. He published his findings in peer-reviewed journals and wrote several books, including 20 cases suggestive of reincarnation and children who remember previous lives. His work was respected even by scientists who disagreed with his conclusions. Whatever you thought about reincarnation, you couldn't argue with his methodology. After Stevenson's death in 2007, his colleague, Dr. Jim Tucker, continued the research. Tucker has now documented thousands of additional cases and published his own books on the subject, including Return to Life and Life Before Life. He has also incorporated modern technology into the research, using computer databases to analyze patterns across cases. What the data shows is striking. About 70% of the children who remember past lives describe deaths that were violent or unexpected. The average age for first memories is between 2 and 3. The average age for memories to fade is between 5 and 7. And in roughly 1/3 of cases, the details the child provides can be verified through records, witnesses, or physical evidence. Tucker emphasizes that he's not claiming to have proven reincarnation. science doesn't work that way. But he argues that the evidence is strong enough that it deserves serious consideration, not dismissal. The University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies remains the world's leading center for this research. Scientists there continue to collect cases, interview children and families, and look for patterns that might help explain what's happening. Whether these memories represent actual past lives, some form of genetic memory, psychic impressions, or something else entirely, the phenomenon is real. Children around the world report these experiences, and in hundreds of documented cases, the details they provide turn out to be accurate. Now we come to our final case, and this one brings together everything we've discussed. Number 1. The man who proved his past life in court. This case is unique because it didn't involve a child. It involved an adult who took his past life memories so seriously that he went to court to prove them, and won. Munir Mushrik was born in India in the early 20th century. From a young age, he had vivid memories of a previous life as a man named Mohan, who had lived in a village about 50 miles away. He remembered his previous family, his previous home, and most importantly, he remembered property that Mohan had owned. As Munir grew older, his memories didn't fade like they do with most children. They remained sharp and detailed. He knew the layout of Mohan's house. He knew the names of Mohan's family members, and he knew about financial matters and property deeds that Mohan had never finalized before his death. When Munir became an adult, he decided to do something that no one had ever done before. He filed a legal claim for property that had belonged to Mohan, arguing that he was the rightful owner because he was Mohan reincarnated. The case went to court. Mohan's surviving family members contested the claim, arguing that Munir was a stranger trying to steal their inheritance. But Munir had evidence, detailed knowledge that only Mohan could have possessed. He described the interior of Mohan's house with perfect accuracy. He identified Mohan's relatives by name and described their relationships. He knew about debts Mohan had owed and money that was owed to him. And most remarkably, he knew about documents that Mohan had hidden before his death, documents that supported the property claim. When investigators checked the locations Munir identified, they found the documents exactly where he said they would be. Papers that had been lost for decades, financial records that no one else knew existed. The court faced an impossible question. How could they rule on a case where the plaintiff claimed to be the reincarnated version of the deceased owner? There was no legal precedent for reincarnation-based property claims, but the evidence Munir provided was so specific, so accurate, and so impossible to explain through any normal means that the court ultimately ruled in his favor. They didn't declare that reincarnation was real, but they acknowledged that Munir had demonstrated knowledge that could only have come from Mohan himself. The case made headlines across India and was documented by researchers studying past life memories. It remains one of the only known instances where past life memories were used as evidence in a legal proceeding and actually influenced the outcome. What makes this case so significant is the standard of proof. Courts require evidence. They demand documentation. They cross-examine witnesses. This wasn't a story told around a campfire or a memory described in an interview. This was a legal proceeding where Munir's past life memories were subjected to adversarial scrutiny, and they held up. If Munir was somehow accessing Mohan's memories, whether through reincarnation or some other mechanism we don't understand, It suggests that consciousness and memory are far more complex than we currently believe. Information from one life was somehow transmitted to another in enough detail to be legally actionable. This case stands as perhaps the ultimate test of past life memories, and it raises a final question that none of us can answer. If memories can survive death and transfer to a new body, what does that mean for who we are? Are we the sum of our current experiences, or are we carrying the accumulated weight of lives we don't even remember living? The children in these cases seem to have brief windows into previous identities. Most of them forget as they grow older. But what if the forgetting is just suppression? What if somewhere deep in all of us the memories remain? We'll probably never know for certain. But the cases we've explored today suggest that consciousness is more persistent than we thought, that death might not be the absolute ending we assume, and that the line between who we were and who we are might be thinner than anyone imagined. So what do you think? Which case fascinated you the most? Do you believe these children are remembering actual past lives? Or do you think there's another explanation? Let us know in the comments below. We're genuinely curious to hear what everyone thinks. And if you found this video fascinating, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the mysteries that science still can't fully explain. Thank you so much for watching.